Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin. It has probably not passed your attention that America is about to mark the 250th anniversary of its independence, which is an extraordinary milestone, and yet hardly a day passes without another sign of the nation's deep divisions. Political violence has grown menacingly. There were Democratic legislators in Minnesota who were murdered. The political activist Charlie Kirk as well. One governor was nearly kidnapped. Another's residence was set on fire. Ordinary citizens in a number of different cities have been killed by immigration officials. And as you all know, a shooting just took place near the White House, and the White House Correspondents' Dinner was disrupted by an armed man, and this is all fairly recent. Social scientists speak of negative partisanship, the tendency of some individuals to be more in the thrall of their dislike or hatred of their political opponents, and they are motivated by the positive values of their own party. And the pace of events seems to be picking up, and it is hard to know where this road leads. So it seems appropriate that the Academy's Fritz Stern lecture, as we approach that 250th milestone, should address the question, is the United States on the road to a new civil war? And I applaud you all for coming out for that upbeat title. Who better to answer that question than one of America's foremost historians, Yale professor David Blight, whose work on the Civil War and its lasting effects have distinguished him as a scholar of extraordinary gifts. But before I introduce Professor Blight, a word about the event. The Fritz Stern Lectureship, which is one of my favorite events of the year, was established in 2002 with the generous support of Henry Arnold and Verlag CH Beck, and it honors the legacy of this eminent historian and founding trustee of the American Academy, himself someone who dedicated his life to understanding the varieties of human catastrophe. Born in what was then Breslau in 1926, Fritz Stern and his family barely escaped the Nazis in 1938 and settled in Jackson Heights, Queens, in New York. And he had a remarkably stable life after all those early traumas. He received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD from Columbia University, where he then spent 44 years teaching. And many of those years were spent studying the rise of Nazism and writing about them in such works as The Politics of Cultural Despair, a study in the rise of the Germanic ideology, and Dreams and Delusions, the drama of German history. In one of the few breaks he took from his life in New York, he served as counselor to Ambassador Richard Holbrooke at the U.S. Embassy in Germany in the early 1990s. And legend has it that it was actually Fritz Stern who first pointed our founder, Richard Holbrooke, to the Arnold Villa as a potential location for the American Academy in Berlin. And for that, we are all in his debt. Each year, the Fritz Stern Lecture brings an outstanding public figure who has shown a special dedication to fostering strong bonds between the U.S. and Germany, and that person comes to the Hans Arnold Center or here to Mitte, since we're renovating the Hans Arnold Center, and we bring them here for in-depth exchange with German colleagues, counterparts, and the interested public. Former Fritz Stern lecturers include the President of the Federal Republic of Germany, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, historians Tim Snyder, I guess we always look to Yale for answers in difficult times, Margaret Macmillan, and philosopher Charles Taylor. And we are thrilled to add David Blight to that roster and to thank him, and I want to thank him again for coming all the way from New Haven to Berlin to deliver this lecture at this moment. Now about our speaker. David Blight is Sterling Professor of History and Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. He has authored or edited a dozen books, including Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, which came out in 2018, and which won the Pulitzer Prize, the Bancroft Prize, the Francis Parkman Prize, and 5 others. Not bad. His other works, American Oracle, The Civil War in the Civil Rights Era, came out in 2024. He has published 2 annotated editions of the first 2 autobiographies of Frederick Douglass, who has been a centerpiece of his professional life. In 2020, he was asked by the president of Yale University to lead the Yale and Slavery Working Group, which led to his 2024 volume, Yale and Slavery, A History. In the course of his career, he has taught at North Central College in Illinois, at Harvard University, and at Amherst College. Though I would be remiss if I didn't mention that before starting graduate studies at the University of Wisconsin, he taught high school for 7 years in his hometown of Flint, Michigan. It was in Flint, right? And very notably, he also played baseball for Michigan State. Big deal. What position did you play? You were a pitcher. Oh. He recently finished a term as the president of the Organization of American Historians, the preeminent organization of people in the field, and he writes frequently for publications including The Atlantic and the New York Times. In 2020, David Blight was elected to the American Philosophical Society and awarded the Gold Medal for History by the American Academy of Arts and Letters. His lecture will run about 40 minutes, after which I will join him on stage and pepper him with a few questions, and then we'll have an audience question and answer. Please raise your hand for the Q&A and wait for the microphone. And we hope that the questions are reasonably brief and have a question mark at the end. And now, without any further ado, Professor Blight, the podium is yours. Thank you for coming.
Good Abend, good evening. Thank you, Daniel. It is a great honor to be asked to give this lecture in the name of Fritz Stern. When I came to Germany with a Fulbright Fellowship in 1992-93, I carried one of Stern's books with me. I think it was The Dreams and Delusions, although don't trust your memory. This is at least my 3rd or 4th visit to Berlin, but it's been a long time. I was here in 1992-93 on a Fulbright, which, as many of you know, was an extraordinary, amazing time to be in Germany, to be teaching about American history and memory while Germany was at the core of what seemed the transformation of the world. And it was. I have still many friends, and well, some are still alive anyway, in Munich. I loved my time there, and it was a year that I spent a great deal of time also traveling in the East, giving lectures, talking to teachers, and the like. I didn't mean to frighten anybody with this title, and I don't have all the perfect answers in case you're holding your breath. That's not quite what historians do, nor does anybody have the answer yet to that question. Just this past weekend, I was on a panel for what's called the Yale Alumni Reunion Weekend. And in a room of 300 or 400 Yale alums, I was on a panel about a course that I co-taught last year. We called the course America at 250, A History. And we did what nobody does anymore. We taught all of American history in one term. It was fun, it was difficult, it was great. We had 800 people in the course. Afterward, a woman, an alum of Yale, came up to me, and there was a whole group of people. We were chatting and talking, and she said, "I'm from Texas. I'm from South Texas." And before she knew anything about what I was about to do the next day, which was to fly here to Berlin to give this lecture, I hadn't said a word about it. She said, you know, everywhere I go now in idle conversation in Texas, everyone's talking about whether we're going to have another civil war. And I said, wait a minute, say that again? She repeated it. And then I told her I was about to fly to Berlin to give a talk by that title. So it's a pure anecdote, and it's as useless as most anecdotes. But I found it stunning that in regular conversation with friends or people who maybe were not friends, this question comes up. In Washington, D.C., the Archives of the United States, funded in the late 1920s and largely finished about 1935, many of you have been to Washington, it stands almost exactly halfway between the White House and the U.S. Capitol. Even at a mere glance, the building represents a sense of aspirational antiquity and grandeur. It also exudes a sense of permanence. 4 very large sitting statues stand at its corners, one each representing past, future, guardianship, and heritage. 2 gigantic bronze doors stand guard at its entrance, and 72 55-foot Corinthian columns surround the majestic building. At the base of the 4 statues are inscriptions. The pastor's prologue, Shakespeare, study the past, which they attribute to Confucius, but that could be attributed to any 5th grade teacher. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, attributed to Thomas Jefferson. And a wordy 4th choice, attributed to I don't know whom, the heritage of the past is the seed that brings forth the harvest of the future. A great cliche. All of this grandeur, not to mention the 13.5 billion documents housed in the National Archives, meant nothing to President Donald J. Trump on February 7, 2025, when only 2 weeks into his second presidency, he summarily fired the archivist of the United States, Colleen Shogan, without stating any cause. That firing was an opening salvo in the Trump administration's multi-front and ongoing war on the practice of history and on the independent integrity of federal cultural institutions during the past year. Trump's interest in the past, present, future, and heritage is purely personal, viciously partisan, and even, as I'll argue, nihilist. On the east side of the Archives building, high at the top, and seen only from across the street by craning one's neck, is another inscription that should interest us now. This building, it reads, holds in trust the records of our national life and symbolizes our faith in the permanency of our national institutions. Permanency. The passage seems to say that herein lies the bedrock, the creedal founding documents, the enduring record in all their forms of this remarkable American experiment. That formidable edifice says the United States is perpetual, an undying government. But is it? On January 27, 1838, there we are, in Springfield, Illinois, a 28-year-old, ambitious, already quite eloquent Abraham Lincoln delivered a speech at what was called the Young Men's Lyceum. It was a forum for open democratic debate in that prairie state, which was only 20 years old at that time. He called this first public address of his life, quote, the perpetuation of our political institutions. Lincoln felt prompted by a wave of anti-abolition and anti-fugitive slave violence that had just swept through the Mississippi River region. Mob violence such as the murder of abolitionist Elijah Lovejoy in Alton, Illinois, just the year before. And all of this had brought the slavery issue before the nation almost like nothing had before. What has this to do with the perpetuation of our political institutions? Lincoln asked. At what point, quoting Lincoln, shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? The young lawyer politician was in the midst of 4 consecutive terms in the State House of Representatives in Illinois at that moment. He worried that mobs could foment anarchy. Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean, he said, and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined with all the treasure of the earth in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, I'm still quoting Lincoln, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio River or make a track on the Blue Ridge Mountains in a trial of 1,000 years. With a kind of rhetorical sweep and confidence, he continued, at what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up among us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and its finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Pretty stark metaphors. And historians have used those poignant words from the man who, of course, would lead the country through a destructive civil war for all kinds of purposes. I start every one of my lecture courses on the Civil War and Reconstruction with that passage. Perpetuity or self-destruction. Lincoln's prescription for preventing such a division and destruction was faith and practice, faith in and practice of the rule of law. Let every man remember that to violate the law, he said, is to trample on the blood of his father and to tear the character of his own and his children's liberty. Let reverence for the laws, he went on, be breathed by every American mother to the lip-sing babe that prattles on her lap. Let it be taught in schools and seminaries and in colleges and in courts of justice. In short, still his words, let it become the political religion of the nation. How are we doing with that? I wonder if all the new civics education programs spreading across America are employing this Lincoln in their advocacy, or something more tame. Then Lincoln warned of the rise of tyrants. His word. They will emerge in the darknesses and failures of democracy. A tyrant seeks, in Lincoln's words, regions hitherto unexplored. Tyrants will by their will twist history to their own purposes. They make, quoting him, no distinction in adding story to story upon the monuments of fame erected to the memory of others. The tyrant, said Lincoln, denies that it is glory enough to serve under any chief. He scorns to tread in the footsteps of any predecessor, however illustrious. American-made tyrants will appear, Lincoln predicted, and with the loftiest of ambition, they will abuse or reject any law he said, to the utmost stretch to possess and retain power. Tyrants, said Lincoln, set boldly to the pulling down of peoples and states to their own ends, not their perpetuation. The United States, as we all know, is on the eve of the 250th anniversary of independence, and that is amazing. Few republics have, perhaps no republic has ever lasted that long. But just now our ship of state leaks in all kinds of visible ways. It tilts under the weight of a ruler and his schemes of vanity and lawlessness, and his regime is pulling us down. Our Constitution is in many ways dysfunctional. Our major political and educational institutions largely distrusted, whether right or wrong. Our Supreme Court lacks public trust more than perhaps any time since the late 1850s. Many smart and devoted people are working every day, and a lot of you are, to reform or remedy these problems. But we all face formidable structural and human obstacles. We have destroyed ourselves before, once, and almost at least two other times, in the Great Depression and the disruptions, to use a nice word, of the 1960s. Are we on the road again to disunion? Are we already there? How do we know? If we are to grasp our own moment or to know whither we are tending in the current crisis, we must, of course, look backward. We got here through both long and short-term paths of great political and cultural changes. During the final quarter of the 20th century and into the immediate post-9/11 moment, the United States endured what the great cultural historian Daniel Rogers called an era of disaggregation, a great age of fracture. I believe I have fracture. You remember this, and this, and this. Whoops. Sorry, Abe. 21st century. Age of fracture. Since the 1970s, American high politics descended or ascended, depending on your point of view, into wars of ideas. Dan Rogers was hardly the only one to use that term. The ideas and changes were big ones. Conceptions of human nature that during the World War II era had stressed social circumstance, institutions, unity, history, tradition, gave way to notions of choice, agency, performance, desire, and self-realization. Gender and sexuality underwent a revolution and offered wholly new ways of thinking. Gay and lesbian people came out of millions of closets. Voluntary associations and community building activities seemed to decline. More and more people apparently bowled alone, in Robert Putnam's famous metaphor and best-selling book. A conservative revolution occurred and especially found traction in an age sometimes labeled Reaganism for its anti-government and anti-1960s reaction. Conservative think tanks emerged everywhere with a new, what Rogers called counterintelligentsia, advancing potent ideas on the right about all sorts of questions: the nuclear family, women's rights, market economics, Cold War foreign policy. Some of these conservative intellectuals pushed, even for a little while, a greed is good mentality. Others, Christian evangelicalism, and still others, a Burkean defense of stability and tradition. Conservatism had no single way. Some conservatives especially thought the country went too far in its reforms about race, resented affirmative action, forms of edgy art, and almost anything that they believed threatened traditional family values. Liberalism, whether earned or not, or imposed by right-wing media, developed a reputation for excessive government handouts, artistic visions where anything goes, and a kind of educational philistinism. The American left tended to move into the academy and found tenure in ever-divided English departments and other disciplines, now at war with each other and themselves over theories of power, over a linguistic turn, and ever-expanding forms of multiculturalism and fashions of interdisciplinarity. The left seemed happily driven by the notion that knowledge and virtually everything that flows from it is socially constructed. Sometimes the left lost its footing in the idea that all truth is utterly relative, elusive, and anything but universal. All ideas inspired, of course, all those ideas inspired powerful conservative backlash. It used to be in the academy you couldn't use the word universal without being challenged. A so-called me generation of lifestyles had at least a short run of fame. Forms of redistributive justice took American pluralism to new levels of diversity and powerful structural changes in corporate and educational institutions. These cultural and ideological revolutions left many Americans rudderless, seeking solace in religion, in private schools, in gun ownership, and a right-wing revival that promised to restore their country, return gender to comprehensible practices, stop abortion, and make the nation muscular again, as it won the Cold War and created a short-lived Pax Americana in which Americans turned on each other. Dan Rogers, who I previously mentioned, shows that no single dominant idea or a set of ideas prevailed into the early 21st century, but a swirling, what he calls, contagion of metaphors competed with each other for the imaginations of Americans as they found themselves in one culture war after another. Almost every culture war we face these days has immediate roots in the 1990s, if you look for them. Some of these were over historical memory, the study of which boomed in the 1980s, 90s, and early 21st century, and I was part of that. Americans divided fiercely over how to preserve, interpret, or teach their history and their memorials in the wake of the Cold War. A search for history standards and new measures of excellence in education surged with great controversy throughout the 1990s. The Holocaust Museum opened in Washington on the Mall to acclaim and controversy, as any great museum probably would and should. The Columbian Quincentennial caused roiling fights over a discovery of America versus the deep histories of Native Americans and their fates on the North American continent. Culture wars exploded over race, Black studies and curriculums in law schools, over an approach to race called Afrocentrism, which may have run its course, in the ongoing effort to face the bitter legacies of racial inequality all around us. The legal and culture war over abortion and women's bodily autonomy moves slowly on its increasingly intractable special rail of American politics. The idea of identity became a problem of utter multiplicity and conflict, of sexual preference, of blood quotients, of an industry of genealogy, of certainties and capacities, of newly energized notions of inherency, of inclusion and exclusion, and even of the right to know about, write about, or even study other people's stories. That's division. Identity became its own politics in America, almost at times unthinkingly and automatically due to policy, preference, or default. At times, identity struggles all but replaced notions of national citizenship. Let's get these people off of there if we can. That's Dan Rogers' book. It's a fascinating title, Age of Fracture. Language itself, especially in the academy and in publishing, became its own politics. For some, language was now that which ought never to offend, an identity that which one could think with as much as about. Blunders on our way to a new pluralistic society, one might argue. But we did learn as we fought, sometimes about our rich and beautiful parts at the expense of a whole. In this age of fracture, late 20th, early 21st century, our politics lost solidarity. The Constitution itself became the subject of fierce, if dead-end debates about originalism, and we began to call ourselves polarized as a nice word or a nice substitution for divided in heart, mind, and soul. By the end of the last century and into this one, according to Dan Rogers, Americans found themselves living in a cultural, he called it, nest of controversies, so toxic that they infested both political parties and prompted some Americans to sidestep any notions of a public or a civic good to fight it out in a kind of winner-take-all quest for wealth or power. Ideas, norms, and the notion of national values in an age of fracture became what Dan Rogers called a ragged turbulence, without centers and without safe landings. There were specialists everywhere, but few generalists to bring coherence to a national narrative of common aspiration. And yet, before 2016, these fierce divisions did show that democracy was alive in debate and argument. And so was diversity, if you looked and you listened. The attacks on 9/11, of course, unified us, profoundly unified us for a while. We went into what seemed a necessary foreign war. But quickly, Americans not only lost their innocence about their place in the world, but even more, they rediscovered their own divisions over the misadventure of the Iraq War, voter suppression practiced by the George W. Bush administration, a politics of fear and hatred, the election and presidency of the country's first black president, Barack Obama, and a slowly rising right-wing counterinsurgency against that 44th president, and a newly demonized liberalism considered dangerous and targeted for destruction by the American right. Slowly but surely, as both Obama and his vice president and later successor as President Joe Biden argued incessantly that Republicans were their opponents and not their enemies, on the contrary, our politics became tribal warfare. Liberals are perhaps still catching up to the imperatives and tactics of this kind of political warfare. However much we disdain it, American politics, at the national level at least, has become about enemies who must be stopped and defeated in social media, on the internet, at the voting booth, and sometimes in the streets. A broader context for all of this may be the 4-decade collapse of the high-wage, high-benefits economy, of deindustrialization, fomenting an unraveling of that post-World War II social structure that left the American working class already tilting toward what was called Reagan Republicanism, and vulnerable to the promises of a shameless oligarch who in the 2016 primaries absconded with the Republican Party, seemingly against all odds. A blustering, lawless demagogue, the kind predicted by Abraham Lincoln in 1838, and so often predicted actually by our founding fathers in the debates over the Constitution and in the Federalist Papers, famously by Hamilton and Madison. And even better in some ways, in many works of great literature by Mark Twain, Sinclair Lewis, George Orwell, Octavia Butler, Omar El-Akkad, and others. That man, so long predicted, became President of the United States. To this moment, 10 years later, Americans still live under the heavy weight of a homegrown authoritarianism fashioned by Trump and his party and the right-wing think tanks and media empires that have provided the intellectual infrastructure for this movement. We live in a country that still has no political consensus about climate change as the most existential threat, perhaps, to humanity. I've been reading, I don't have it finished. I'm not certain I would recommend it yet unless you have the disposition to deal with it. But do you know the novel by Omar El-Akkad? He's a Turkish-Canadian and now American writer. It's called American War. It's one of those futuristic sci-fi apocalyptic novels. It's the American Second Civil War. It breaks out in the year 2074 because the US Congress has just passed a law outlawing fossil fuels. And Florida is no more. It's a series of islands because of the rising oceans. Louisiana has lost 1/3 to 1/2 of its landmass. The war actually breaks out near the oil refineries of Louisiana. It does become a north-south regional, sectional war. It goes on for 20 horrific years. It's even going to include a massive plague. They start using biological weapons that kill 100 million people. But Akkad brilliantly takes a single family through that story. And some of them are still alive at the dawn of the next century. But it's the Second American Civil War, in effect caused in great part by climate catastrophe. Our culture wars in America are old in their roots, but they now animate our politics. From news sources, all kinds of electronic media, from rostrums at the Pentagon, from that long cabinet table, well, and other efforts of vanity projects by the president. Let me get to the cabinet. There it is. That's President Trump's most recent cabinet meeting. You may have seen the photos. He handed out a new version of the red cap that has Mount Rushmore on it. Do with that as you wish. But everybody got a new cap that day. Everybody genuflected. Everybody paid homage to the emperor. Now, Our culture wars come from pulpits. Our culture wars come from state legislatures trying to seize control of curriculums and therefore youthful imaginations. They've locked up many American voices in a kind of official censorship and self-censorship. They are driven especially by sexuality, religion, and race, and with increasing physical manifestation in the brutal immigration policy that closes our country off to outsiders, many of whom we need, and they surely need us. Thousands now reside in detention centers in the United States, which are prisons, really, where they suffer ill health, they eat bad food in ICE custody. These sites, as you know from following the news, have become places of protest, places of, so far, mostly quite peaceful collisions between protesters and police. But if you want to find the dark heart of Trumpism, there are a lot of places to look. But one place to look is one of his executive orders. It's the executive order issued on March 27, 2025, last year. It's the one called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. This executive order is on the lips and on the minds of everybody in the federal government who works in any kind of cultural institution. I've spent a fair amount of time recently with people in the National Park Service because I'm planning a symposium for them. They're under a terrible degree of censorship, but they talk about this executive order by its number. I don't know, it's number 4202 or something. They just give it its number. Trump's White House fights a war on woke, a term that has become largely meaningless, every day. Part of the governing by executive order, which is the Trump administration's modus operandi, is its attempt to erode, control, and even destroy the federal institutions that represent America's historical, scientific, artistic heritage to the public. That executive order is the one that attacks the Smithsonian Institution, declares it hopelessly woke, run by radical lunatic leftists, quote unquote. It takes on the National Archives, and of course he had fired the American archivist. But it launches an attack on all of the institutions that present our past, our heritage, to the world, like the Smithsonian, which gets 31 million visitors a year to its magnificent 22 museums, the largest and greatest museum complex, some might say, anywhere. What's at stake in that executive order, as they keep trying to enforce it, are truth, trust, and the freedom to know, speak, and create. That's a lot. Censorship and self-censorship are now a festering reality all over America. I want to make an argument that I draw from a book, a marvelous book, by James Davidson Hunter. The book is called Democracy and Solidarity on the Cultural Roots of America's Political Crisis. It came out just before the 24 election. Hunter is a religious scholar. He's a very careful scholar, and he doesn't play in the game of whether we're heading toward a civil war. But he lays out this idea, it's a fascinating idea, that any democracy to survive has to establish the boundaries of what he calls tolerable difference. How do you manage tolerable difference? And he says we're increasingly failing. Now, there are lots of ways and reasons, but he makes the argument, which I picked up on, that what's really happening, what Trump and Trumpism really is, Forget all that use of the term narcissist for Trump. He's really a nihilist. And if you look up the word, it fits. A nihilist is one who brings about a genuine civilizational decline. He wants it. The end of any potential universal conceptions of something like truth or value or purpose. The nihilist may value nothing except power and the self. Nihilism can be passive. It can be what Hunter at one point calls sleepy, or it can be energetic, dangerous, and violent. The latter kind of nihilist makes a world without any moral worth or even any ultimate meanings. The nihilist essentially accepts an end to truth, a world in a condition of existential despair, and without what he calls ethical coherence. The nihilist is a devil that smiles at earnest protesters with brilliantly conceived placards and posters, and goes about his business of self-dealing, lawlessness, and ever bigger lies. Truth and the necessity of sustaining trust in leadership and institutions is a blunt obstacle to the will to power. Trump is the closest thing to a genuine nihilist we have ever known in high power in America. He is not guided by ideology or a political tradition or a particular philosophy. He is driven by a quest for wealth, I suppose that's an ideology, and to attain and keep power. And he is driven by a daily need to dominate a news cycle, which is the oxygen of the nihilist and the tyrant in power. If Trump has a working model, it is gangster and boss politics, clientage of the most corrupt kind. His leadership style demands constant infusions of sycophancy and self-aggrandizement. He has launched numerous and expensive vanity projects that I'm sure you've all heard about. The ballroom, I'll back up to that one just for a moment. He can't give this up, and he's already torn down the whole wing of the White House. I was in Washington just 3 weeks ago. It's hard to look at, actually. The White House is being dismembered in the interest of that ballroom. Now, and I do want to say, he is actually trying to remake the landscape of Washington, D.C. Whatever you've heard about that, it's true. He's trying to do to Washington what Mussolini tried to do to Rome, which is he really left his mark on it. And perhaps what Hitler did with Nuremberg and Munich. He wants his name on federal buildings, on airports and train stations by self-acclamation. It's all illegal, but he's still trying. He's violating all sorts of conceptions of constitutional congressional authority, but he just does it. He just put his name on the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, and now a federal judge has told him to take it off. And apparently he's going to do it. We'll see. What's happened with Trumpism, though, also, a last point about this, is that it has become, and what nihilism does, is it has made democracy itself the target, the enemy, a system that they judge as outdated, cumbersome, and poisoned by the ideals of liberalism, ancient virtues, and the inconvenience of the rule of law. Our politics is broken, but we can hope, not yet completely. We may be on a path to ruin or to profound renewal through transformative political events we cannot yet know. Trump's nihilist working model may be self-destructing, or it may seize even more levers of power than we have yet seen. We're at a crossroads. We have a big election coming. It may have to be destroyed from without, hopefully by constitutional means and through elections. But stop a moment and think of those photos of a Trump cabinet meeting or of the January 6th rioters, the mobs. All members of that cabinet gathered around an oval table, their new red MAGA caps stationed in front of each secretary. The press stands cramped off to one side of the room. Cameras are whirring, and the entire performative spectacle of a kind of monarchical loyalty plays out before them for the nihilist in chief. Friedrich Nietzsche, of course, wrote enduringly about this phenomena. Nihilism, Nietzsche said, stages ethical incoherence. It fashions or performs the end of moral interpretation of the world. To the nihilist, there is no good reason to even ask why about a policy or an event. Lying becomes breathing to the nihilist. The truth, a game played in the service of a more useful aim, which is dominance. There is nothing to life that has value, Nietzsche famously wrote, except the degree of power, assuming that life itself is the will to power. Now, I want to say a word about this book and how it affected me, just a quick word before I end. Barbara Walter is a political scientist. She's part of a whole cadre of social scientists who have for years now, really ever since the end of the Cold War, have been studying how civil wars start, hence the title of her book. She's involved in particularly one of those centers, and they have created a massive data set or database. Their theory is essentially this. They take countries, and she shows that there have been, I don't know, somewhere more than 100 civil wars since the end of World War II in all sorts of countries. But their scale is from, first of all, closed autocracies to free and open and well-functioning democracies. But their theory is, and it's very interesting, that it's all the stages in between, the middle zone, as they call it. They have a name for it, which is very academic. They call them anocracies. It's such an awkward term, I don't use it. It's the countries in between that are either moving out of autocracy toward democracy in certain ways, stumbling, but in certain ways, and then the democracies that are beginning to erode and fail and collapse. It's either a democracy moving back to the middle or an autocracy moving up to the middle. They argue that that's where most civil wars occur. In the turmoil, sometimes great conflict, and even chaos that comes in the transitions from autocracy to forms of democracy, or from democracy into forms of autocracy. And they show it with a lot of evidence that this is the case in about 75 to 80 of all civil wars they've studied. In fact, during the 90s, some of you may know this or even worked on this, the American CIA asked these research centers to do these kinds of studies so they could begin to understand what's going to happen in the wake of the Cold War. Well, a lot of chaos happened in the wake of the Cold War. Now, I'm a little skeptical of all these data sets, and I'm not much of a data historian. I like narrative, I like deep research, I like storytelling, but her book got my attention because the United States is one of those democracies falling into the middle zone. We have all the warning signs, all the ingredients. Now, lastly, I just want to say that what we also need to do, and in the longer version of this that I'm trying to publish, I go back to the 1850s, the one time in our history when this country did descend into civil war, where we proved and showed that republics are sometimes extremely violent. And one of the reasons for that is that in republics, dissent is free, or mostly free. And arguably the greatest dissent in American history was the Confederacy. We never had anything else quite like it. We had a Supreme Court decision in 1857 about this man. That's Dred Scott, the painting of him. And that's Roger B. Taney, Chief Justice of the United States, who rendered the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which among many cascading events of the 1850s sent the United States into a descent into disunion. I think more than anything else, what did it was the Dred Scott decision. A Supreme Court decision that argued that black people were inherently inferior and had no rights, which the white man must respect, and could never, ever be citizens of the United States. And it opened up the potential of the expansion of slavery everywhere, not just in the West, but even in the North. It terrified all those new, young immigrant clerks and farmers who were going west and believed in free labor. They could have been racist to the core, but they believed in free labor. It clarified more than anything, the Dred Scott decision did, this division in America between two different kinds of futures. One that would be free labor and the kinds of notions of mobility and rights that would come of that, and the other, slave labor and the oligarchies that would rule it. In the next 3 years after the Dred Scott case, the United States tore itself apart. And one warning I would leave us is that beware when political parties begin to divide. It's one of the great lessons of the 1850s. Our political party system in the 1850s tore itself apart. The Whig Party ceased to exist. It was replaced by the original Republican Party, which was the anti-slavery political party, which in great part the South used as, after Lincoln's election, used as its cause, its immediate cause to secede from the Union. Abolitionists were vilified, had been for 3 and 4 decades, as dangerous radical left lunatics. They were the liberals and radical left lunatics of their own time. And some of them wanted disunion. They saw it as the only possible way of ending this hideous institution of slavery. Our disunion happened upon a all too long and virulent history of mob violence. The Constitution itself, this is our risk, was in the end, by 1860 and 61, unable to contain the deepest issues of that time. And I'm not giving it its due here. But when the Constitution cannot contain our greatest of questions, it breaks. Now, I want to end with, as I often do, a passage from Frederick Douglass. I've spent half of my life studying Mr. Douglass. He's always there when we need him or I need him. He sort of lost his way in this passage, to be honest, but it works for us, I think. It comes right after he had had a special meeting that he led, where he led a delegation of black leaders, most of them ministers, to the White House to meet with Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln. This was the winter of 1866. Everything was up for grabs about the policies of Reconstruction. The Congress is debating what would become the 14th Amendment. They're debating what would become the first Civil Rights Act. None of that's passed yet. This is February 1866. Douglas takes a delegation of 12 black men to the White House, and they got an audience with Andrew Johnson, who was a virulent racist, also a states' rightist. He was Lincoln's vice president for reasons I could explain, which has always been a little troubling, but there he was. They went hoping they would have a dialogue with him about the future of the freed people, the future of black rights. They got no dialogue at all. Johnson gave them a 45-minute lecture. He lectured them about how the greatest problems in America are faced by poor white people, not by the former slaves. A very modern sort of idea. He hectored them about how they should wait for political rights. They have no business with the right to vote. And on he went. And Douglas kept trying to interrupt Mr. President, and Johnson would have nothing of it. And finally, after about 50 minutes, Douglas, in effect, said, "We're done here." And he asked his delegation to rise, and they walked out. And as they were walking out, Douglas overheard Johnson say, and so did a journalist, "That N-word, he'd just as soon cut my throat as do anything else." And I don't know exactly what Douglas was thinking. I've always imagined he must have turned around and stared at Andrew Johnson in the eye and held back from what he wanted to do, which was to go and knock Mr. Johnson's teeth out. But what Douglas did is what he always did. He went back to a desk at a hotel and he started writing a new speech. He was the greatest orator of the 19th century. I could come back to these if you want, but there he is. Those were no King's rallies. More on that when we sit down and talk. But Douglas went back to his desk and he wrote a speech that he called "Sources of Danger to the Republic." And he gave that speech all across the North in 1866 and into 1867, 100, 200 times. And in it, he called Andrew Johnson, quote, "an unmitigated calamity," and a, quote, "disgrace the country must," quote, "stagger under." And then Douglas, frankly, became alarmist. He overreacted. He lost his cool. He recommended 3 amendments to the Constitution. One, abolish the presidential veto, because Johnson was vetoing every piece of legislation coming out of Congress. Second, abolish the pardon power. Couldn't have done this, but abolish the pardon power because Johnson was pardoning hundreds and then thousands of ex-Confederates. And third, abolish the vice presidency itself. Now, that was not a sane idea. Mr. Deal kind of lost his cool. He was so frightened by the demagoguery of Andrew Johnson. And then he ended with a maxim that I think still works. "Our government," said Douglas, "may at some time be in the hands of a bad man. When in the hands of a good man, it is all well enough. We ought to have our government so shaped that even when in the hands of a bad man, we shall be safe." Which is his way of saying, if the Constitution holds, we can have bad people in the presidency or Congress. We will have bad people, all people do. But we must have laws. How about a rule of law that sustains us? Are we safe? I don't know. Thank you.
correct me if I'm wrong, but in the century that you study, that would be called a stem winder. Is that correct? Or is that a 20th century?
Douglas or me?
You.
Douglas. Oh. Maybe, I don't know. Douglas got called all kinds of things like that, but he could spin a phrase.
So I thought your discussion about Trumpian nihilism was really fascinating. And just to try to connect the dots here, as remember we used to say that all the time after 9/11. The theory of the case is that the country is susceptible to nihilism because there are so many resentments and so many angers and so many fixations on identity, as you went on at some length, that the nihilists can create a coalition of hatreds. Is that your understanding?
Oh, for sure. I mean, if you just look at the way liberalism, a big and vague term, of course, it has deep historical roots, it has modern definitions, but the way in which liberalism is maligned is a coalition of ideas. Kevin Roberts, who is president of the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., one of the wealthiest and most powerful of all right-wing think tanks. In fact, the source of the book that was called Project 2025 came to Yale to speak to the student debating union, and his topic was 12 ways liberalism ruined America. And he had 12 ways. I then did a podcast with him where I tried to come up with 12 ways that it actually may have done something good, but he wasn't going to have it. But so no, they are a coalition now. But how much Trumpism is still a coalition, and how much of it is just an authoritarian cult, seems the question.
And to bring us up to the very moment, it seems like the wheels are coming off of that coalition.
It may be, and depending on your point of view, and they have a lot of flat tires.
Yeah,
but it may be, because he has backed away now from. He just said okay. He didn't say sorry, but he said okay to the federal judge who said you can't put your name on the Kennedy Center. He has, for the moment, said nothing or okay to the federal judge who is stopping this so-called $1.7 billion slush fund for his friends. In fact, the federal courts are the bulwark against Trump, and it is making him stymied.
Yeah, so that's exactly the point is, I mean, if you look at the last few days, he's had one defeat after another in the courts. And it's not a binary thing, blowing through court orders or not. He does both. It does seem as though right now the courts are the main impediment to the further seizure of power.
They are.
Until you get to the Supreme Court.
Until you get to the Supreme Court, that's another matter. But also, let's not forget, he has, against the odds, I think, seized control of the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is utterly loyal to Donald Trump. That completely violates the historical norm that we had some right to believe the Department of Justice was that, a Department of Justice. It's not now. Now, when does that break? When do the wheels come off that? He fired Pam Bondi, his first Attorney General, and now has his second Attorney General, who, if anything, is even more fiercely loyal to Trump than Bondi was. I don't know how to predict anything about this, to be honest, except that what greatly concerns me is when and if and how the Republican Party itself will do anything to stop him, or to stop the Justice Department, or to stop the Pentagon, We don't know. And we could learn something about that in the next week, because Congress comes back into session today, I think. And maybe, just maybe, there are a few Republican votes for a war resolution that would stop the Iran war. I don't know. There were Republican votes, it appears, to stop this $1.7 billion slush fund to give money to the January 6 rioters, if you can believe that. And frankly, Dan, this is one of the things that you follow it here too, and we live with every day. Which outrage might actually make people do something? There's so many. We're bombarded with Trump's lies, his assaults on norms, his assaults on law. Which one do you choose to resist? And honestly, I had some pictures here of the signs at No King's rallies. You've heard of those rallies. They've been amazing. I mean, the millions of people who've come out, and rather ingenious ways that that organization has planned these things. But I've come to the conclusion that what liberals are best at is making signs. I mean, we're really good at placards, and they're incredibly creative. And yet, where does this go next? What's the next kind of resistance? Hard to say. You were saying to me earlier that it's astonishing that there's been little, if any, protest on American college campuses.
Yeah. So I believe it was Thomas Jefferson who said something along the lines of the tree of liberty needs to be nourished with the blood of patriots occasionally.
He even said at one point every 19 years. I don't know where he got that term from. Why 19?
I think it was to coincide with the locusts. But so I guess the question is America failing the test of civil disobedience? That's really an interesting question.
Well, you know, I'm not sure it's for me to say. It's easy to say to other people, you should go put your body on the line, or you should engage in civil disobedience. I could hector my students about that, and I probably will next fall in modest ways, outside the classroom, not in the classroom. But at some point, you know, resistance has to take a form other than waiting for the next election. We have faith in elections, that's a good thing. But it may take more than that.
Yeah. So my last question, you, in your analysis and your litany of the problems that have driven us into this place, mentioned the economic pretty much in passing, very briefly.
No, I had a longer paragraph on that, but
I know, and you wanted to make sure to fit the time. But you know, a lot of people look at this and say it is ultimately all about just staggering and rapidly growing inequality, and the fact that you know, democracies thrive on middle classes, and their middle classes falling through the gaps.
I even brought it here. I just looked this up today. The top 0.1% hold 13.5% of all national wealth in the United States. The bottom 50% holds only 2.5%. We are a wildly unequal society, and the signs are that's only going to get worse because of the power, especially of the AI tech companies. In fact, that long-term change, way before we ever talked about AI, the loss of manufacturing jobs, the high-wage unionized jobs of the American working class. It's actually where I came from, in Flint, Michigan. My grandfather, my father, they all worked in factories. They were able to own a home and a car, and could manage even to pay modest tuition at a state university for their kids. That's a lot of lost dreams now, and it's the same with farmers in many ways. Family farms are failing. Now, this is all such a litany of the negative, and you must be kind of sick of it by now. You need a good drink, probably. On the other hand, there's a tradition we call the Jeremiad, which is named for the prophet Jeremiah, whose purpose in the world, his job, was warning about the troubles to come, for the people, for the children of Israel. And there's a lot of Jeremiads going on in America now, a lot of analysis, all kinds of it. And yet, it's still going to take some kind of political action by people. Because the whole thing's at stake. The whole thing's at stake, this American experiment. I've talked to quite a number of federal employees just in planning a conference we're doing in 2 weeks. People who still have their jobs and many who have been fired. And these are civil servants. Approximately 300,000 federal employees have been fired by the Trump administration. They don't know where they're going next. They're hoping one day maybe to get back their jobs. But that's where you see that, and look how fast this has happened. That's where you see that a demagogue who gets power and is, by the way, immunized by the Supreme Court. Don't forget, in 2024, that presidential immunity decision by the Supreme Court now ranks right up there with the Dred Scott decision as one of the worst in our history. There's no immunity for the president from committing crimes in our Constitution. They invented that in a 6-3 vote. He is free to do whatever he wants, and he does. So it becomes a kind of government by big lie, government by the next big lie. It's still possible to impeach the president, and the House of Representatives, if the Democrats take it, may or may not. He won't be convicted in the Senate as long as there are 40-some Republican senators, but we're at a crossroads of trying to decide how do we resist this and stop it. And that's why we need imagination. Maybe you can tell us how.
Questions? I saw that hand go up first. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Blight, for this very good talk. But I have a simple question. You know, the title of your talk is the United States on the road to a new civil war. And I don't know much more at this point. So you're just saying, you know, it's a big risk, but is it or is it not? May I add a few thoughts, you know, that might help to answer the question further? The high indebtedness of the United States, it's reaching a point that is unbearable. I don't know what is going to happen with Social Security. And even if we are, in a way, happy to see the MAGA movement being split, I don't know whether a person like Tucker Carlson might, in the end, benefit from that and might be even worse. So what do you think about all that? And finally, if you were forced to answer it in terms of percentages, is the chance of a civil war below or above 50%?
All right, you don't want me to be the social scientist. First of all, I didn't have time to develop. Barbara Walters' analysis includes, well, and anyone with a reasonable outlook will conclude, if there's ever an American Civil War again, it is not going to be like the one we had in the 19th century. There will never be another Shiloh, another Gettysburg, another Antietam. It will not be between large armies arrayed in battle. It will be sporadic violence, which we already have. Sporadic, it'll be assassinations. It will be mass murders, it will be bombings, it will be acts of terrorism. We already have that with more regularity than we would like. So it's, I suppose, what sometimes is called low-intensity conflict. The question is, if that continues, if that sporadic violence continues, and it becomes a norm, when does some of it break out into something larger? We don't know. Is the debt sustainable? Probably not, although there are economists like Paul Krugman who will argue that debt is not always a bad thing. I'm not an economist, but we do have a massive, massive national debt that only gets greater. And every administration that has tried to reduce it has increased it.
Okay. Mr. Zuckerman.
Thank you very much for that thoughtful presentation. I have a question. I mean, it appears to me that the most likely scenario upon many scenarios is that the wheels don't come up, but we have some flat tires, the Supreme Court doesn't stand up, the courts don't hold completely, the Senate and Congress don't do much. If things muddle along, they get increasingly worse. Mm-hmm. And you say you would prefer action by legal means.
Oh, yeah.
Does that mean that eventually you would also follow the Jefferson line of the little revolution now and then might be a good thing? Or is there a point, where is the point where civil disobedience, bordering on civil war, on breaking the system or to try to get the system back becomes a reality?
Okay, I'll answer you with a quote from Martin Luther King, if you don't mind. One of King's great passages was, "Great change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability. People make it happen." And of course, in the civil rights movement, direct resistance, direct civil disobedience, usually peaceful, brought about tremendous change over time. It brought about the 64 and 65 Civil Rights Acts, which were a transformation of American society, and our Supreme Court just gutted the Voting Rights Act 3 weeks ago. I can't give a percentage. Who can? Are we at 55%? Actually, some of these political science centers do give percentages in this middle zone of countries heading away from autocracy or away from democracy. They do have quotients. They'll give you a percent if you like, a 60% likelihood of collapse of that democracy. I don't see how you do that. We probably will muddle along. I mean, even in this great apocalyptic novel I pointed to, the Civil War doesn't happen until the 2070s, so that's a good muddle. Most of us will be dead and gone. And by the way, in that novel, there's even a whole thread about how people collect memorabilia of this massive, terrible war, just like we do today about our original Civil War. I don't know. I mean, sporadic violence is sporadic, but it's, as you were pointing out in your introduction, it includes assassinations. I mean, it includes attempts on the president over and over. There'll probably be a couple more. Who knows? We have a society under security. There is so much security in America now. I mean, you have it here too, but I mean, I was in Washington, D.C. just 2 weeks ago. It's just incredible how much security there is. You can't get near a building, although they're closing many of the Smithsonian museums over the 4th of July because the Trump administration is having a Formula One race around the mall. So the reason you can't get to the Smithsonian that week is because the presidency chose to close them. Why would you want to go to the Smithsonian when you can watch a Formula One race, after all? Sorry. In fact, I just committed one of the sins we're all committing. We lampoon this situation. We do. We have to. We have to have humor or we die. We lampoon him. He's so lampoonable. But at some point we have to put satire and irony aside and attack it back. So I believe in civil disobedience, yes, and I think we should be training, I'll go on record with this, I think we should be training students who wish to, young people, not as part of curriculum by any means, but voluntarily training young people to engage in civil disobedience if they so choose, which is what happened in the civil rights movement. And then maybe, just maybe, it could become necessary for 1 million people to gather in Washington and a few thousand of them get arrested. And say to the world, this is unacceptable. I don't know when that'll occur. I hope it doesn't have to. I hope Trumpism just collapses of itself. The wheels come off. And it may be. But who here welcomes a wounded Donald Trump? A wounded Trump seems to me as dangerous as a triumphant Trump. Maybe not. Maybe he'll just quit and go buy an island or something.
So you've sparked a memory. Is this the victory of the South that we're experiencing?
Is it the victory of the South? Not precisely by any means, but, and I've written 2 op-eds that argue this the last few years, Trumpism was and is potentially, again, a lost cause. I mean, think about it. What was January 6th but a mob prompted by a man, a president, engaging in his own forging of a lost cause ideology. Lost causes of the virulent kind, whether it's the French after the Franco-Prussian War, Germany after World War I, or the United States after its Civil War, need justifications for defeat. And Trump's justification for defeat, of course, was fraud. It was election fraud. And you shout that enough times and people start believing it. It was a lost cause. The trouble is, it's one of the very few lost causes I can think of in history that managed to get right back into power quickly. I hope and I think it could be on a trajectory of becoming a new lost cause. It's not the South's victory, Dan, but it is a victory of this kind of right-wing reactionism to that which had changed this country. Don't forget, I mean, Ronald Reagan was not a Donald Trump by any means, but Reagan ran against the 60s, against feminism, against gay rights, against civil rights. You go back and look at Reagan rhetoric, go back and look at Reagan's 2 elections. He was running against the changes of the 60s. That's still what the American right runs against. Nothing more so than on sexuality. Now it's the transgender issue, which they've milked for all it's worth. You know, I don't know. I should be leaving you with hope, and I'm struggling for it. So. Sorry about that. Another question back there, I think.
Last question there in the back. Sorry.
Hello, Christian Anderson. Thanks for being here. What if, at the end of the Civil War, the beginning of Reconstruction, we had done something like Nuremberg, instead of pardoning and electing Confederates into office, but had executed justice?
Many people have reflected on that, imagined it, written about it. What if we'd had some war crimes trials? We had one for the commandant of Andersonville prison. men in Wurs. He was convicted and executed for a crime against humanity. Virtually every Confederate leader, only a few of them were actually jailed at all. Jefferson Davis, its president for only 2 years, and then he was released because they never got around to fully indicting him. Now, there are reasons for this. The country was so devastated, the necessity of healing so real, that a culture of reconciliation began to set in much earlier than it seems like perhaps it should have. But yes, if there had been, let's call them war crimes trials if you like, let's call them treason trials, because if the Confederate leadership hadn't committed treason, then there is no treason. They made war on their own government. That is the definition of treason under law. What if you had arrested, tried, and either jailed for long periods of time or maybe a few executions, 20 or 30 of the top leaders of the South? What if the legendary Robert E. Lee had been tried for treason? He eventually becomes a sentimental, romantic hero, the equivalent of Abraham Lincoln by the early 20th century, in that culture of reunion. I wrote an entire book on this called Race and Reunion. Yes, but Reconstruction was itself, as first conceived, pretty harsh on the South. You know, the radical Republicans set up a system that disfranchised ex-Confederates, at least for 4 or 5 years, didn't allow them to vote, didn't allow them to hold office in the first governments that were created in those southern states. The problem was there wasn't the political will in the North to sustain the occupation of the South, the enforcement of the Reconstruction Acts, and there are many reasons for that, not least of which was the Great Depression that hit the country in 1873. Here's your economic story. If that panic of 1873 hadn't led to a nearly 20-year on and off again depression, Reconstruction might have been sustained a bit longer. Reconstruction, though, at least laid down those 3 great constitutional amendments, 13th, 14th, especially the 14th, and the 15th Amendment, which was about voting rights. We still live under the 14th Amendment, but our Supreme Court in the next week, 2, 3, sometime this month, is going to set down a decision about birthright citizenship, which is the opening line of Section 1 of our 14th Amendment, which many have argued is the one part of our Constitution that holds us together. That's the equality before law clause following the birthright citizenship. If they outlaw birthright citizenship, I don't think they're going to go that far, but I'm not a court watcher. If they do, there will be a rebellion of some kind in the United States. There are millions of Americans, I'm confident, will choose not to live in a society that abolishes birthright citizenship, which has been there for 160 years and defines us. Millions upon millions of Americans have become citizens because they're born there, wherever they're from, wherever their parents are from. If they strike that down, and probably at least 2 of the Supreme Court justices will, I think this problem goes to a new level. Although that depends on Americans actually understanding that 14th Amendment, which we may or may not have a lot of confidence in.
I think we're going to have to stop there. I want to thank Professor Blight for a really fascinating talk.